What if the family that raised you was built on a lie? In this gripping tale of betrayal, buried secrets, and long-awaited revenge, Camille Dawson returns to the mansion that once cast her out. Armed with painful memories and hidden truths, she unravels a decades-old conspiracy that shatters everything her family pretended to be. But will exposing the truth bring justice or more heartbreak? Stay with us as we uncover the dark legacy behind the Dawson name. This isn't just a story about family. It's about reclaiming identity, one truth at a time. Every Wednesday night, Gregory came home smelling like cedar wood. Not the kind I used to buy him. His old cologne was subtle, woodsy, mature. This one was sharper, younger, like something out of a gym locker room commercial. It clung to his shirt, mixed with the faintest trace of vanilla and something I couldn't name. The first time I noticed it, I said nothing. The second time, I held his shirt under running water and watched the scent swirl down the drain. It had been 7 years since we moved into the 2-story house in East Cobb, Georgia. White picket fences, granite countertops, 2 golden retrievers we never had time to walk. Gregory was the kind of man who never raised his voice, never missed a mortgage payment, and always made sure his tie was perfectly symmetrical. People looked at us and saw security, elegance, partnership, but perfection is just another word for tightly curated fiction. The unraveling began on a random Friday. I came home from a 12-hour mediation hearing, heels in hand, head pounding. His briefcase was on the kitchen counter, the jacket to his suit neatly folded over the back of a bar stool. But the shirt, that shirt, was draped carelessly over the living room armchair. I knew that wasn't him. Gregory was clinical with his clothing. That sloppiness didn't belong to my husband. It belonged to someone intoxicated by attention. I picked it up, holding it like evidence, and inhaled. Cedar wood. Too sweet. Too bold. Not him. "Trying something new?" he said when I asked about it later that night. His tone casual, eyes not quite meeting mine. "Don't like it?" I shrugged and walked away, opened the fridge, grabbed a soda. Half the can was gone before I realized I hadn't blinked. The shift didn't happen overnight. It was gradual, like water dripping into a crack in the wall, spreading through the foundation until everything quietly collapsed. His Wednesday meetings became overnight trips. Phone calls took place behind closed doors. I told myself it was stress, new product launches, executive reshuffles, but the lie I was feeding myself became harder to swallow each day. The breaking point came in the form of a text message. Laura, an old law school friend who now worked in the legal division of Gregory's company, sent me just one line. "Hazel, I probably shouldn't say anything, but I just saw Gregory having dinner with a blonde at Sky Terrace. It wasn't you. Are you okay?" I stared at it for a full minute, sitting in my parked car outside the office, engine still running. I didn't feel rage. I didn't cry. I just felt cold, hollow, like my body had gone into a state of emergency shutdown. Amelia Cross, that was her name. I found it in his emails the next morning after he left for the gym. Her name showed up in calendar invites, travel confirmations, late-night team calls. She was a marketing associate, newly transferred from headquarters. 28, blonde, former fitness model. I remembered her now. At the previous Christmas party, she had complimented my emerald dress and said it brought out my warmth. I'd smiled, reflexively, politely, the way I smile at witnesses on the stand when I know they're lying. Not impulsive. I don't act without facts. So the following Wednesday, I dressed plainly, pulled my hair back, and drove to Sky Terrace. I arrived early, ordered a glass of white wine, and chose a corner table that gave me the best line of sight to the entry. At 7:12 p.m., Gregory walked in with her. His hand gently guided the small of her back as they were led to a table. She smiled up at him, hair tucked behind her ear. I watched as he leaned in. She said something that made her laugh. then reached for her hand. I had imagined this moment before. What I would feel if my suspicions were true. Anger, maybe, betrayal, sadness. But all I felt was the sting of clarity. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was real. It was happening. And it had been happening for a while. I left before the entrees were served. I didn't need a scene. I needed him to say it first. 3 days later, Gregory stood at the vanity in our bedroom, towel drying his hair. I sat on the edge of the bed, the same place where I once told him I wanted to build a life with him. My voice was calm. "I saw you at Sky Terrace," I said. The towel slipped from his hands. He didn't deny it, not really, just looked away and muttered, "You must have misunderstood." "No," I said evenly. "I saw your hand on her back, and I remember her saying she liked cedarwood cologne." He turned, tried to force a chuckle. "Hazel, it's not what you think, but I already knew it was exactly what I thought." Gregory stood in front of the mirror, fumbling for composure. His reflection had always meant everything to him. He kept a small comb in every jacket pocket, trimmed his nails with surgical precision, and once told me that image buys you time in a courtroom, in a boardroom, and in life. Now his reflection betrayed him more than I ever could. He turned slowly, as if careful movements could rewind time. "It's complicated," he said. "No," I replied. "It's simple. You lied, repeatedly, and not just to me." He opened his mouth, then closed it. Walked toward the dresser, started folding the towel just to avoid my eyes. Silence stretched between us, heavy and deliberate. I let it linger. Finally, he muttered, "Things between us haven't been right for a while." My jaw clenched. "Since when?" "Since I started working 60-hour weeks so you could buy commercial real estate? Since I stayed up editing your presentations while you fell asleep at 9? Gregory turned then, his face tight with frustration. "I'm not saying it was right. But it wasn't planned. It just happened." I stood up. "Affairs don't just happen. You didn't slip on a banana peel and land in her bed. You chose it. You chose her over and over." He had no answer for that. That weekend, I packed his things, neatly, just like I'd folded our life together, one corner at a time, making sure nothing spilled over. I placed his ties in the case he never used, the signed copy of Principles of Negotiation he always bragged about, the mug that read World's Best Regional Director Amelia had gifted him last Christmas. The irony burned, but I didn't flinch. I didn't cry. I didn't plead. The house belonged to both of us, but I stayed. He left. That too felt symbolic, like the truth finally settled into its rightful place. For a while it felt like I'd reached the end of our story. I would move on. He'd build his new beginning with her, and eventually life would file this away into one of those silent corners of history that polite company didn't mention. But life rarely grants us such clean exits. 6 weeks later, on a Thursday afternoon, a storm rolled through East Cobb. I'd just closed a client file when I heard the knock. 3 sharp raps, soaked in urgency. I opened the door, and there he was, standing beneath the porch overhang, drenched in rain and desperation. His eyes were bloodshot, lips chapped, hair flat against his forehead. For a moment, I didn't recognize him, not because his face had changed, but because mine had. "We need to talk," he said, voice hoarse. I crossed my arms. "We already did. You made your choice." "Camille," he whispered. "Amelia's pregnant, 11 weeks. She says the baby's mine." I didn't blink, just stepped back and let the words hang in the air like thunder, refusing to strike. I didn't scream, didn't slam the door. I simply stared at him, letting the silence dig into the hollow he'd created. "You think I deserve to know?" I asked. He hesitated. I just thought you should hear it from me." "No," You thought I'd give you something. Permission, a reaction, but I have nothing left to offer you." He stood there motionless, rainwater dripping from his coat, eyes pleading. But the look in my eyes must have told him what my words hadn't yet. "You're not the victim here." That night, I sat alone on the couch, the dogs curled up at my feet, the lamp casting soft gold over the walls. I replayed our wedding vows in my head, not because I missed him, but because I wanted to remind myself how easily words could lie. For love, for trust, for a shared future. None of it meant anything anymore. And that was the final betrayal. Not that he had cheated, but that he had desecrated something sacred and expected me to mourn quietly. I stared at the ceiling and whispered to no one, "This isn't grief, it's freedom dressed in unfamiliar skin." And as the storm outside finally quieted, I realized something even deeper than rage. I wasn't afraid anymore. The worst had happened, and I was still here, breathing, thinking, waiting. Not for him. Not for anyone. Something had begun to shift inside me, slowly but unmistakably. I was done waiting for the truth to be handed to me. Now I would go find it. The silence that followed Gregory's confession didn't comfort me. It coded everything, my walls, my routines, even my voice, like fog that wouldn't lift. I didn't call anyone, didn't cry. I just functioned the way people do after car crashes or funerals, outwardly calm, inwardly echoing with shock waves. I went to work. I cooked pasta I didn't eat. I watered the backyard plants on schedule. But something in me had gone into triage mode, sorting damage, waiting for the full pain to catch up. I think I was buying time, bracing for the question I hadn't allowed myself to say out loud. What if the child was hit? It lingered like static between thoughts. 11 weeks. I did the math. That ultrasound appointment she skipped, that weekend he claimed to be at a leadership retreat in Savannah, it all lined up too perfectly. But then again, liars always keep track of calendars better than the truth tellers. Gregory texted twice over the weekend, once to check if I was eating, the second time just a simple, "thinking of you." I left both messages unread. On Monday morning, I walked into our firm's midtown office with a folder under my arm, filled with nothing but blank legal pads. I wasn't ready to work, not really. I just needed to be somewhere that wasn't saturated with memories of him, of us. My assistant Natalie looked up when I walked past her desk. "You okay?" she asked. I paused. "I'm in that phase where you feel fine, so you know you're not." She nodded slowly. "That's when the real fight starts." I offered a thin smile and kept walking. That night, I opened my laptop again. Not to check Gregory's emails. I already knew what I would find. Instead, I opened a separate browser and typed her name, Amelia Cross. It was astonishing how carefully she'd curated her online image. Smiling headshots, wellness quotes, a short feature in a company newsletter about young talent redefining pharma branding, but buried in the second page of search results was a conference video from 2 years ago. She was on a panel about digital media. Her voice had that same polished cadence I remembered from the Christmas party. She talked about building authenticity while sitting next to a man I instantly recognized, Daniel Scott. My pulse quickened. Gregory's college roommate. His best man at our wedding. A friend I hadn't seen in over a year, maybe more. He and Amelia had been at the same event, same city, same timeline. The realization didn't feel like discovery, it felt like falling through ice. I grabbed my phone, scrolled through old contacts, and dialed his number before I could talk myself out of it. "Daniel?" I said when he picked up. He sounded surprised. "Camille, wow, it's been a minute. I need to talk to you." "About Amelia." There was a pause. Then his voice dropped. I figured this might come. We met the next evening at a small cafe on Juniper Street, halfway between my office and his apartment. It was dimly lit, quiet, the kind of place where secrets felt less dangerous in the hush between espresso machines. He was already there when I arrived, nursing a cup he hadn't touched. He looked thinner than I remembered, a man who'd been holding something in too long. "Why didn't you ever tell Gregory?" I asked after the second sip. "Because I didn't think it would matter," he said, simply. Until she showed up pregnant, the words hit like a gavel. Daniel looked at me, guilt darkening his eyes. "Amelia and we were together. Earlier this year, a few months, nothing official. Then she ghosted me. I didn't hear a thing until I saw her photo with Gregory on LinkedIn." "And the baby?" He hesitated, then reached into his coat pocket and pulled out his phone. After a few swipes, he turned it toward me, a blurry grayscale image. An ultrasound. Underneath it, a message from Amelia. "Forehead's totally yours. Let's hope the stubbornness skips." I read it twice. Daniel's hands were trembling now. I don't know what to believe. She never said outright, but she also never denied it when I asked. My throat tightened. I wasn't just standing at the edge of betrayal anymore. I was staring into the crater it left behind. And I knew, with bone-deep certainty, this wasn't just about two broken marriages anymore. It was about a child. And a truth buried under too many polished lies. I sat in stunned silence, the ultrasound photo still glowing on Daniel's phone between us. It was surreal, so ordinary and clinical, yet it carried the weight of a wrecking ball. The black and white shape in the image didn't just represent a life yet to be born. It represented a lie carefully crafted, nurtured, and protected. And now that lie had a heartbeat. "She sent you that?" I finally asked. He nodded, pulling the phone back with a quick, self-conscious motion. At first, I thought it was just some weird attempt to get attention again. But then she followed it with messages. Late-night ones. Emotional ones. Vague enough to be deniable, but pointed enough that I couldn't stop thinking about it. He scrolled and read aloud. "I don't know if I'm ready for all this. If it blows up, will you still be there?" Then another. "Jared doesn't suspect anything. I've played it careful, but I'm scared." He stopped, then said quietly, "She never uses names, it's always implied." "Classic manipulation," I said, unable to hide the bitterness in my voice. Daniel looked at me. "Do you think Gregory really believes the baby's his?" I leaned back. "I think Gregory believes what he needs to. He's a man who confuses control with truth. If he tells him what fits his version of the story, he'll take it, especially if it keeps the illusion alive." He sighed. "I never wanted to be part of this. I thought it ended months ago. I didn't even know she joined his company until after she disappeared from mine. I could feel something shifting in me. Anger, yes, but more than that. Resolve. I had spent weeks letting things happen to me, holding on to calm like it was a virtue. But this was different." "You still have everything?" I asked. "The texts, voice memos, that ultrasound?" Daniel nodded. "All of it." "Good," I said, pushing my empty cup aside. "Then you and I need to have a conversation with Gregory. But not in private. Not behind closed doors where it can be spun or softened. No. He'll hear the truth the way I did, without warning and without mercy." He stared at me, uncertainty flickering across his face. "You want to go public?" "I don't want revenge," I said. "I want clarity, and I want that child to enter the world without lies hanging over its name." He rubbed the back of his neck. "What are you thinking? There's a party next Friday, Langston Hotel, Grand Oak Room. It's not public knowledge, but I have a friend who still gets those circles invitations. It's a celebration of Gregory and Amelia's new chapter." Daniel blinked. "A party? Seriously?" I nodded. "Exactly where their version of reality is at its most polished, where everyone who matters to them is watching. That's where the truth should live." He let out a low whistle. You're not afraid of scorched earth, are you? I've already walked through the fire, I said. Now it's time to let the smoke clear. We parted ways outside the cafe. Rain had started to fall, soft and misty, coating the streets in a dull sheen. Daniel pulled up his hood, then paused before crossing the street. You're not doing this just to humiliate them, right? I looked at him, steady. No. I'm doing it because every lie they've built is growing roots, and one day that child will ask questions. I want the answers to be real. He gave a small nod. Then I'll bring everything. Originals, screenshots, even the voice recording. I'll handle the rest, I said. All we have to do is speak the truth. That night, I sat at my desk and opened a new folder on my computer. I titled it Reclamation. Inside, I began sorting every file, every thread, every scrap of data like an attorney preparing for trial. Because this wasn't just personal anymore. It was a case for dignity, for truth, for breaking the generational habit of hiding everything under the rug, and for the first time in weeks, I felt something close to calm. Not the silence of surrender, but the quiet before the storm. The day after our meeting, Daniel sent me the voice recording. It came as a single audio file with no subject line attached. To a short message, use it if you need it. I won't ask how. I stared at the waveform hovering on my screen. The message was barely 17 seconds long, but it held more weight than a 1,000-page deposition. He doesn't suspect a thing, Amelia's voice said, soft and syrupy. I haven't even let him touch my belly during the appointments. Honestly, things are going smoother than I thought. I played it twice, then once more, letting the words soak into my skin like poison. There was no ambiguity, no room for misinterpretation. Her tone wasn't fearful. It was rehearsed, triumphant even. I clicked save and dragged the file into the folder marked Reclamation. It joined the ultrasound, the annotated messages, the receipt from the Asheville hotel, a mosaic of deceit slowly fitting together. At noon, I called Gregory. He answered on the third ring, his voice caught somewhere between defensiveness and fatigue. Camille, we need to talk, I said. Face to face, he sighed. I don't know if that's a good idea. No lawyers, no Amelia, just you and me. And a coffee. A pause. Where? The place on Juniper, you remember. Another pause, longer this time. Yeah? I remember. He arrived first. That surprised me. He was seated near the window, back straight, hands clasped like a man preparing to deliver bad news, not receive it. I slid into the seat across from him, my expression unreadable. He offered a nod. You look, well. I didn't return the pleasantry. You're going to want to listen and not interrupt. He frowned, already bristling, but said nothing. I pulled a folder from my bag and placed it gently on the table between us. It was black, nondescript, but heavier than it looked. Inside was everything. The ultrasound printout, the texts from Amelia, screenshots with timestamps, the recording on a USB drive tucked into a paper sleeve. Gregory stared at the folder as if it might bite him. What is this? He asked, not reaching for it. The truth you didn't ask for. The one you should have found before building a life on someone else's story. He hesitated, then slowly opened the flap, each item he touched like it burned. His eyes scanned the texts, the photo. He didn't even make it to the recording before his hand stilled on the page where Amelia had typed. Forehead's totally yours. Let's hope the stubbornness skips. He looked up at me then, jaw tight. Where did you get this? Does it matter? I said. You needed to see it. That's all. He leaned back in his chair, the color draining from his face. She said I was the only one. That it was timing. That we were aligned. I watched him, waiting for it. The denial, the anger, the blame. But all I saw was a man realizing his entire world had been built on unvetted trust. Gregory, I said, quieter now. This isn't about you or me. It's about a child who deserves to be born into the truth, not a soap opera. He rubbed his forehead. What are you going to do with all of this? There's a party next week, I said. The Langston Hotel, the Grand Oak Room. He blinked. You wouldn't. I nodded once. I would, because someone has to stop pretending. He looked away, out the window, as if searching for some alternate version of this conversation. But there was none. Just the truth, sitting open on the table like a wound. I gathered my things. You have until Friday, I said. Tell her yourself. Or it was what I will. Then I stood and walked out, leaving the folder behind, its edges already curling under the weight of what it contained. The night before the party, Daniel came to my office. He didn't knock, just opened the door with a tentative hand and stepped in like he was afraid the floor might collapse beneath him. I've got everything, he said, holding up a slim black document folder. Original texts, voice memos, screenshots, even some receipts from Asheville. He paused. I also printed the email thread where she first told me she missed her period. I looked up from my desk. You sure you're ready for this? He hesitated, then nodded. No, but it's not about being ready. It's about being accountable. He sat across from me as I pulled out a second USB drive from my drawer. The same recording I'd saved 2 days ago was now duplicated, labeled, and backed up 3 ways. I didn't want any part of this moment to depend on trust. Trust was a luxury I no longer believed in. She still hasn't said anything definite to you, has she? I asked. Daniel shook his head. Not clearly. She dances around it. Last night, she texted. I can't sleep. Everything feels wrong. Are you okay with how things turned out? He exhaled. I don't even know what that means. It means she's afraid the floor is cracking, I said, and she's hoping someone will catch her before she falls. I won't, he said softly. We spent the next hour going through everything again, line by line, date by date. I didn't want holes, didn't want the kind of half-prepared moment where someone could dismiss the truth as bitterness or speculation. If we were going to do this, it had to be undeniable. When we finished, I slid a sealed envelope across the table to him. It's a copy of everything. If I get stopped, verbally, legally, emotionally, you make sure this lands where it needs to. Daniel took it without a word. The room fell quiet. We stared at the fluorescent lights humming above us, both of us too awake to feel tired. Eventually, he broke the silence. She said something once. I didn't think about it at the time, but it stuck with me. His voice dipped into something hollow. She said, "You're kind, but kindness doesn't win." I nodded slowly. It doesn't, but it survives, and that matters more. The next morning passed in silence. I avoided my phone, turned off all notifications. I knew Gregory wouldn't call, and if he did, I had nothing left to say. By the time the sun dipped behind the high-rises of downtown Atlanta, I was dressed and ready. I wore a black square-neck dress, the same one I had worn during my first courtroom victory years ago. I called it my statement dress. Not flashy, not soft, but sharp enough to make people listen. Daniel met me in the hotel lobby. He wore a tailored navy suit, not new but pressed and clean. His eyes were steady, but I saw the way his hands flexed at his sides when we stepped toward the banquet doors. Inside, the Grand Oak Room looked exactly like I remembered, elegant, lit in gold, filled with people too polished to sweat. Gregory stood near the podium with a champagne flute in hand, Amelia at his side. Her dress was champagne silk. Her hand rested on her slight belly, a symbol of their carefully packaged narrative. When they saw us, the music didn't stop, but the air did. Conversations faltered. Heads turned. Whispers floated. Amelia smiled at first, reflexively. But when she realized who I was, that smile tightened, then faltered completely. I walked with Daniel to the center of the room. The silence stretched. The clinking of glasses ceased. "Thanks for inviting me to the party, Amelia," I said, my voice steady. "I brought a gift. Something I think Gregory should open before anyone else raises a toast." Her eyes narrowed. "Camille, this is a private event. If you have something to say..." "I do, but I'm not saying it for you." I turned to Gregory. "This is for you. For all the versions of you that refuse to see what was right in front of you." I placed the folder gently on the nearest table. Daniel stepped beside me, unflinching. Gregory reached for the folder, but he didn't open it. Instead, he looked at me, really looked at me. For the first time in months. "What is this?" he asked. "Proof," I said simply, "of who you're celebrating with and who the child she's carrying might really belong to." The room gasped, and I watched his fingers tremble on the flap of the folder. Seconds before everything he believed about his future began to fall apart. The Grand Oak room had never been quieter. Gregory's fingers hovered over the folder, and for a moment no one breathed. The clinking of glasses, the murmured toasts, even the background jazz had disappeared into a vacuum of collective shock. Amelia stood a step behind him, her smile frozen mid-gesture, like a porcelain doll caught mid-fall. I waited. Let the moment thicken. The weight of what we brought wasn't meant to crash. It was meant to crack. Daniel's voice was the first to cut through. "Gregory," he said calmly, "you should look at it, all of it." Amelia let out a dry, nervous laugh. "What is this, some kind of performance? You're turning a private celebration into a courtroom?" "No," I said, steady and cold. "Courtrooms allow for objections. This doesn't." Gregory opened the folder. He flipped through the documents in silence. The ultrasound, annotated with Amelia's note. The message where she hinted at fear and doubt. Late-night confessions that blurred in lines between truth and emotional manipulation. His hands shook slightly as he reached the USB taped to the final page. Daniel stepped forward. "Play it," he said, "or I will." A waiter, clearly caught in the wrong place at the wrong time, stood frozen nearby with a tray of untouched hors d'oeuvres. Gregory handed him the USB and muttered something. Moments later, the room's speakers hissed as the recording loaded. Amelia's voice filled the air. "He doesn't suspect a thing. I haven't even let him touch my belly during the appointments. Honestly, things are going smoother than I thought." It was unmistakable. Smooth, deliberate, calculated. There was no mistaking who was speaking or what she was saying. Gasps broke out. The woman at the far end of the room clutched her wine glass like it might answer her questions. A man near the window lowered his phone, clearly debating whether to record more. Amelia turned sharply toward Daniel. "That's fake. That's not my voice. This is a setup. Some bitter ex and a jilted wife playing detective." "You sent me that voice note at 12:47 a.m., Daniel replied, voice steel. "Same night you sent the ultrasound. Same tone. Same manipulation." She flinched. Gregory looked between us, all like a man trying to locate himself in a map that no longer matched the terrain. "I gave up, Camille," he said slowly, the words catching like stones in his throat. "For you." "I didn't ask you to," Amelia snapped, the edge in her voice slicing through her facade. "You did that on your own." Daniel stepped forward, his face unreadable. "You told me you loved me. You said you weren't sure the baby was his. You said..." "I said what I had to," she hissed, "because none of you were ever enough on your own." There it was, the real voice behind a polished image. I looked down at the folder still open on the table. "Now you've said it out loud." Gregory no longer looked angry. He just looked hollow. like something vital had slipped out of him and he hadn't realized it until now. He turned to Amelia, eyes glassy. "When were you going to tell me?" She didn't answer. People began to move, slowly at first. An older couple slipped out, heads down. A small group of colleagues whispered apologies and backed away, the kind reserved for funerals or ruined weddings. Even the string quartet in the corner was quietly packing their instruments, unsure whether to play or vanish. Gregory still hadn't moved. Daniel looked at me. "Do we say more?" "No," I said. "The truth doesn't need a monologue, just daylight." I turned to walk out, and Daniel followed. But before I reached the door, Gregory called out, softly, not to stop me, but because it was the only thing he had left. "Thank you," he said, "for not letting me live inside that lie." I didn't turn back. My heels echoed against the marble floor as we stepped into the hall, where air returned to my lungs and the world somehow felt quieter than ever. We didn't speak as we exited the Langston Hotel. The gold trim of the revolving door glinted under the soft light of evening, casting warped reflections of us both, two figures who had just detonated a truth that couldn't be buried again. Outside, the air was crisp, freezing almost, but I welcomed the sting. It made me feel alive in a way I hadn't for months. Daniel walked a few steps ahead, his fists clenched at his sides. I could tell it was taking everything in him not to look back. I didn't need to. I could already imagine the wreckage. Gregory motionless, Amelia surrounded by her collapsing ambitions, and a room full of strangers now burdened with a secret they hadn't asked to witness. I caught up with him at the edge of the parking structure. "You okay?" He let out a dry laugh. "No, but I guess that's the point." We stood in silence, watching headlights pass like ghosts. Finally, he turned to me, voice low. "You didn't have to do that for me." "I didn't," I said. "I did it for the child. For the version of her that might ask one day, why didn't anyone say something?" He nodded. "Do you think Gregory will be okay? I think he'll finally have to choose who he wants to be without a lie propping him up." Daniel looked down. "And Amelia?" I exhaled. "She'll survive. People like her always do, but it won't be the life she thought she could manipulate her way into." We didn't need to say much more. The truth had already said enough for us. Later that night, back at home, I changed out of the dress slowly. I draped it over the back of the chair like it was something sacred. For years, I had worn versions of myself: wife, partner, advisor, silent observer. Tonight, I had walked into a room and left as something else entirely: the woman who ended performance. My phone buzzed. It was a text from Gregory. "I'm sorry I believed her because it was easier than believing I'd failed again. You didn't deserve what I did to you. None of this is on you." I stared at the message for a long time. I didn't reply. Forgiveness, I'd come to understand, doesn't require a reply. Sometimes it just requires space. The next morning I received a voicemail from Amelia. It was short, measured, almost too calm. "I know you think you did the right thing. Maybe you did. I'm leaving Atlanta. Please don't contact me again. This doesn't concern you anymore." She was wrong. It had never been about her. It was about what had been stolen. The truth, the choice, the dignity. And now, that truth was no longer hers to hide. 3 weeks later, I got an email from Daniel. The subject line was a single word: arrival. Inside was a photo attachment: a newborn wrapped in a soft knitted blanket, a hospital band on her tiny wrist. Her name? Lily Scott. Beneath the photo, Daniel wrote, "She's here. She has my jawline, cries like thunder. And when I held her, I didn't think about Amelia. I only thought about who I have to become now." I stared at the screen. unable to look away from the small, sleeping face. For the first time in a long while, I smiled, not because it was happy, not because it was easy, but because something had broken free from all that darkness. I sent a one-line reply, "She'll grow up knowing the truth. That's everything." That weekend, I planted 2 white lilies in the backyard. One bloomed fast, eager, the others slower, cautious. I knelt beside them, hands in the dirt, eyes stinging from the sun. Some stories don't end in vengeance or ruin. Some end in quiet things, like clarity, like peace, and some began again, not with fury, but with something softer. A truth told out loud, a child born into it, and 2 people finally choosing who they want to be. The house felt different now, not emptier, just honest. In the wake of Amelia's departure and Gregory's long overdue silence, a strange sort of calm settled over the Whitmore estate. But peace, I'd learned, could be deceptive, like a still lake concealing what had sunk to its bottom years ago. I stood in the hallway, outside the door to the study Jared used to claim as his private office. I hadn't entered since the day I left, but today something was calling me back. Something beyond old memories or unfinished conversations. The key turned with surprising ease, and the door creaked open into stillness. Dust clung to the edges of the walnut desk, the air heavy with the scent of old paper and leather. Everything was as he'd left it. The silence was louder than any argument we'd ever had. I opened drawers without knowing exactly what I was looking for. Contracts, letters, receipts, proof of something deeper, perhaps, some window into the mind of the man I'd once trusted with my entire future. But none of that showed up. What I did find was a sealed manila envelope, tucked beneath a file marked Property, Whitmore Holdings, Private. No label, just a single strip of red wax on the flap. I broke the seal with a hesitant hand. Inside were handwritten letters, not from Jared, but from Evelyn. His mother, the woman who had passed less than a year before, the one who always gave me that peculiar, unreadable smile at family dinners. The one who never called me Hazel, but that clever little girl Jared brought home. I unfolded the first letter. "Hazel, if you're reading this, I'm already gone, and I imagine you're wondering why I left these for you and not Jared. The truth is, I never trusted my son with certain truths, but I trusted you, with your quiet watchfulness, your sense of decency even when it hurt. You saw through things. Maybe even me." I paused, my breath caught somewhere between a laugh and a gasp. Evelyn had written to me in secret. I read on. "Jared is not the man you believed he was, nor the son I raised him to be. He's not cruel by intention, but weak, and weakness, Hazel, when cloaked in charm, becomes dangerous. You must understand, our wealth, our legacy, was never meant to be kept in the hands of someone who confuses love with leverage." The second letter was shorter, dated just 3 weeks before her death. "There's a safety deposit box, Unit 1092 Morgan Trust Bank, under my maiden name, Evelyn Granger. Inside are the original documents from the company transfer Jared manipulated, along with a copy of a prenuptial agreement he had drafted behind your back. He never filed it, but he intended to, just in case." I sat back, the weight of the letters settling into my lap like bricks. It wasn't just betrayal I felt. It was validation, the gaslighting, the subtle isolation, the moments when I questioned my own reality. It had all been part of something larger, something designed. Evelyn had known, and instead of protecting her son, she'd tried to leave a lifeline for me. That night, I drove to Morgan Trust Bank. The vault was housed in an old stone building on Ponce de Leon Avenue, just outside Midtown Atlanta. I showed my ID, Evelyn's letter, and after what felt like a lifetime, was escorted into a steel chamber of silence. Box 1092 clicked open with a cold finality. Inside were two things: a black leather binder with embossed initials EEMG and a thumb drive in a sealed plastic pouch. My hand trembled slightly as I reached in, like touching either object would shatter what remained of my past illusions. Back in the car, I didn't start the engine. I just sat, gripping the steering wheel, staring out at the city lights flickering like tiny truths, always there, waiting for darkness to make them visible. The question now wasn't just what the documents contained, it was what I would do with them, and whether exposing Jared would be an act of vengeance or simply the final chapter in reclaiming the life I should have had all along. I drove without a destination, the binder and flash drive buckled in the passenger seat like silent accomplices. My thoughts spiraled with every turn, every red light that blinked like a warning. The city blurred by in streaks of gold and gray, and by the time I pulled into the driveway of my apartment building, the sky had begun its slow descent into night. I didn't go inside. Instead, I took the binder and drive to the small community workspace in the lobby, an open glass room with a single computer and printer for residents. It was late, so the room was empty, the fluorescent lights buzzing faintly overhead. I logged into the computer, slipped the drive into the port, and clicked open the only folder it held, Contingency for Hazel. My stomach tightened. Inside were several PDF files. The first was a scanned copy of a document titled Whitmore Holdings Internal Transfer Agreement, unsigned. My heart pounded as I read. It was dated 6 months before Jared and I separated, months before any of the fights, before the distance set in. It outlined an attempt to shift full controlling shares from the family trust into Jared's name. But what stopped me cold was the signature line, Evelyn Granger, signed and crossed out in thick red ink, and beneath it a note in Evelyn's handwriting. This is coercion, not consent. I opened the second file. It was a draft of a post-nuptial agreement. Jared's name was typed neatly at the top. My name followed, but not my current legal name. He had used my maiden name, Hazel Carter, without my knowledge. The document detailed asset separation clauses, custody conditions for hypothetical children, and a non-disclosure agreement that would have prevented me from ever speaking about our marriage publicly. It was airtight, ruthless, unfiled, but finished. I leaned back in the chair. It was all here. Not just betrayal, but premeditation. Jared had built an escape route long before our marriage began to crumble, possibly before it began at all. Suddenly I understood why Evelyn never fully warmed to me. It wasn't disdain, it was shame. She had seen the damage coming but couldn't or wouldn't intervene. The final file was a video. I hesitated, then clicked. It was grainy, surveillance style, a dated timestamp in the corner, September 12th, 2020 p.m. It showed Jared inside the Whitmore study, alone, rifling through a drawer. He was pulling out a small, leather-bound book, my old journal. He flipped it open, began scanning its contents, then took photos with his phone. The footage cut off after 20 seconds, but it was enough. He'd violated more than trust. He'd weaponized intimacy. Memory. My own words. The weight of it settled over me like fog, thick and choking. I felt every ounce of exhaustion press into my bones, but I didn't cry. I just sat there, very still, as if silence itself might become a shield. Later that night, I visited Daniel. I didn't bring the binder or the drive, only the letter from Evelyn. He read it in silence, jaw tight, eyes scanning every word twice. I always thought there was more to Jared, he muttered, but this is calculated. I need to decide what to do, I said quietly, not just for me, but because if he's done this to me, he'll do it again to someone else. Daniel placed the letter down carefully. You don't have to expose him out of anger. You can expose him because it's right. There's a difference. I looked up, His gaze was steady, not pushing, not demanding, just there. That drive, I said, could end him, and it could free you. A long silence stretched between us. Finally, he asked, "Are you ready for that?" I didn't answer right away, but in my chest something shifted. A quiet resolve, the kind that builds slowly, like water behind a dam. "I'm not ready," I said, "but I will be." The next morning, I stood outside Whitmore and Whitmore Legal, the firm Jared once paraded as his legacy. I held the binder under one arm, the flash drive secured in a plain envelope addressed to one of Evelyn's old associates, an ethics lawyer now working in corporate investigations. I didn't go inside. I simply dropped the envelope through the mail slot, turned, and walked away. This wasn't revenge. This was reclamation. And I wasn't done yet. The scent of fresh-cut roses lingered in the entryway of the Whitmore estate, sickly sweet beneath the chill of the central air. Camille paused on the threshold, heels clicking against polished marble. The house hadn't changed. Same ornate mirrors, same oppressive quiet. But she had. She hadn't come alone this time. Elias stood at her side, arms crossed, scanning the hall like a man trained to read danger in silence. And behind them, tucked discreetly under Camille's coat, was the folder. Sealed copies of the original will, Evelyn's final letter, and, most damning of all, a notarized confession from Teresa Langford, her late mother's former assistant. Everything Camille needed to unravel the empire they'd tried to bury her under. From the dining room came the low murmur of voices. Laughter, too loud. Glasses clinking. She stepped forward, her breath slow, deliberate. It was Charles's birthday. An intimate affair, he'd said in the press, released just close friends and family. But Camille knew better. This wasn't a celebration. It was a coronation. Charles had finally succeeded in transferring the final tranche of the Dawson Trust into his personal accounts. She could feel it in the air, the greed, the gloating. And tonight, she'd dismantle it all. As she entered the dining room, heads turned, conversation stalled. Elaine Dawson sat in her usual place, lacquered in jewels and surprise. At her right, Charles froze, mid-toast, champagne glass raised. "Well," he said, voice tight with practiced warmth. "Isn't this a surprise?" "Not really," Camille replied, removing her coat and draping it over a chair. "You always did forget who the real heir was." There was a flicker of something across Elaine's face. Recognition, perhaps, or guilt. But Charles recovered quickly. "This is a private gathering, Camille. I suggest you—" "I'm not here for the cake," she cut in. "I'm here for the truth." She tossed the folder onto the table, the sound sharp against crystal and porcelain. Silence fell like a curtain. Camille's hands didn't shake. Elaine reached forward first, flipping the folder open with trembling fingers. One by one, she sifted through the documents. Teresa's signed affidavit, the sealed medical report proving Eleanor's cause of death, the audio transcript from Evelyn's old voicemail box. Charles's jaw tightened as he skimmed a page. "This is nonsense," he said. Camille met his gaze. "Then you won't mind if I forward it? All to the Attorney General, or the New York Times, or maybe just the IRS." Elaine paled. Charles stepped back, as if the weight of the papers had struck him physically. "And Camille?" She smiled. Not cruelly, not triumphantly, but with the calm of someone who had stopped needing their validation long ago. She didn't need their shame, only her mother's truth. The silence that followed Camille's words was absolute. It rang louder than any accusation, heavier than the proof now spread across the table. Elaine slowly set down the confession, her trembling fingers brushing against the glass of wine she hadn't touched. Across from her, Charles stared not at Camille, but past her, at a future he could no longer control. "You think this will change anything?" he finally said, voice low, bitter. "You're still just a girl who walked away. No one will listen to you." Camille stepped closer. "I didn't walk away. I was pushed, lied to, cut out of the very family I bled for. But now I get to choose how this ends. And it won't be on your terms." Elias moved to her side and placed his phone on the table. "This entire conversation has been recorded, for legal safety," he said evenly, "should you wish to challenge any of the facts." Elaine flinched. Charles swore under his breath, pacing behind the chair like a cornered wolf. Camille could see it in his eyes, the unraveling, the slow collapse of a man who built his legacy on silencing others. But she didn't feel triumph. Not really. Just release. "I could press charges, make sure this story lands on every front page in New York," she said quietly. "But I won't." Charles froze mid-step. Elaine looked up, confused. "You won't?" Camille shook her head. "No, because some battles aren't worth more blood. I already lost my mother. I won't lose myself chasing vengeance." She reached for the documents, gathering them neatly, then looked at her father. No, at the man who wore the title. "You'll resign from the Dawson Trust before the end of the month, publicly. You'll donate 30% of the assets to the Eleanor Dawson Foundation, and then you'll disappear." Charles opened his mouth, but Camille cut him off. "Or I go public, and you know exactly what that means." He said nothing, just slowly sank into his chair, the color draining from his face. Camille turned to Elaine. "And you can keep the house, the pearls, whatever makes you feel safe, but you don't get to rewrite my mother's story ever again." As she stepped away from the table, the room seemed to breathe again. Camille didn't look back. Later that night, she and Elias stood on the terrace, the city glittering beneath them. The wind was soft, and for the first time in years, Camille's shoulders weren't clenched. "What now?" Elias asked. She smiled, eyes fixed on the skyline. "Now I live on my own terms, because justice had been served, not with vengeance, but with choice. And that made all the difference." Thank you for joining us on this emotional journey. Camille's story is one of pain, strength, and the courage to stand tall against betrayal. Through every twist and heartbreak, she reminded us that truth is worth fighting for, and that healing begins when we choose ourselves. If this story touched you, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more dramatic family sagas and stories of redemption. Remember, sometimes the most powerful revenge is walking away, free, unburdened, and whole. Thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next story.